Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Meditations podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Slomak, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with those around us, just to see what we can pick up along the way. Every other week, I bring on a cool guest from a varied background just to have them share their story and see what we can learn. Here for episode 28, we've got a pretty rockin' individual. We have Greg Bennick on the show. Greg is a famed keynote speaker, a juggler, spoken word expert, a world traveler, now an author with a new book coming out. But he's also the singer of a band called Trial, which was really, really big in the 90s, and another band called Between Earth and Sky, which is still active today. In this conversation, we're going to spend some time kind of talking about discovering the talents that you have, figuring out how to apply your talents to other places. In his case, figuring out how you can take juggling and then apply it to sort of a corporate context. And then ways to stay true to yourself, ways in which you can evaluate what your sort of like internal belief systems are and apply your craft in a manner that is ethical to you. So without further ado, let's hear from the one, the only, Seattle's own Greg Bennick. Greg, thanks so much for beaming in. You're somebody that I always associate with Seattle, but you're actually an East Coaster. You were born and raised in Connecticut.
Yeah, actually, I was born in Pennsylvania, but raised in Connecticut, and then ended up at Syracuse University, and thus the Syracuse connection. There's a lot of Syracuse history, and I think of Syracuse very, very, very fondly, always.
And I'm really excited. I'm going to get there, but I want to start off a little younger because I am curious about, doing some research on you. It was really interesting to hear about, the sort of family dynamic where you've got dad who's going into the city and has these sort of like traditional corporate jobs, and your mom is like, I don't know, a career nomadic might be the term that I'm looking for, where like, yeah, every 10 years she's switching. And I want to focus on that. But even more, I want to know about like your childhood and sort of what you gravitated to as a kid. Like, what were you excited about? What happened in Connecticut? Give me the overview of the Greg Bennick childhood.
Okay, so let's put it in a historical context so we understand a bit. Because if I say, yeah, we were excited to run around and play in the woods, that doesn't make any sense unless you know that we're talking about like, late 70s into the 80s, there's no obviously internet. There's, video games are just coming to the fore. So video games obviously became huge. Arcade games, Atari 2600, that sort of thing. But prior to that, my childhood was forged with kids playing in the street, creative games, because that's what we had. It makes me sound like a dinosaur, but it's true. It's like pre-digital age. We had this game called Outlaw. And in Outlaw, you have one kid who's designated as the outlaw, and all the other kids are the posse. And I don't know if this is the way kids play this game, but this is the way we played it. And the outlaw has 15 minutes to hide in the neighborhood. And I lived in a rural area where there was, say, 8 houses on a street, each one with like woods in the background or in the backyard. The outlaw has 15 minutes to hide within parameters in the neighborhood that you set. And then the posse has 45 minutes to not only find, but actually physically tag the outlaw. So why is this interesting? It's interesting because you get a group of 10 kids together. One kid runs off into the woods and is gone. And then these other kids have to bloodhound their way to find that kid. And what you end up doing is learning the terrain, learning all the neighbors and where kids are afraid to go and where they're excited to go. You get creative about where you're going to hide. You learn your neighborhood and you learn your neighbors. And all of a sudden I'm sitting, 50 or 60 feet up in a tree, watching all the kids on the street run around the woods, try to find me. And they're unable to. As I watch them, you start to have like a really amazing sense of where you live, and you get really kind of, for lack of a better word, intimate with your surroundings. And that's what growing up was like for me in Connecticut, playing outlaw with my friends and running around in the woods. And we had a good time. It was pretty amazing. And there was a lot of good outlaw stories, which are probably beyond the pale of this podcast. But anyway, running around in the woods was really important to me growing up in Connecticut. That's a thing that we did. We ran around the woods, and then later we ended up in arcades playing video games.
That's amazing. Maybe we'll have to do like a future episode where we only just tell outlaw stories for, an hour and a half. I think listeners need that.
Okay, I'll tell you what listeners need, maybe even more than that, is I come to Syracuse. They don't need that, but what they need is they need a group of people in Syracuse to play outlaw. Like here we are, we've got the SU campus. One person runs away for 15 minutes, and then the other bunch of people have 45 minutes to find them cowering behind the chemistry building. Like that's exactly what needs to happen.
Oh, interesting. Maybe that's what the next adult movement is going to be. Staying in Connecticut just for a couple more questions, real quick, is that I do want to talk about that sort of family dynamic and it was you, your parents, your brother, and you've got this like really cool household where you're seeing kind of a fairly traditional way to run a career with your dad, who's like putting on a suit, going into the city, doing his deal, and then your mom, who, if I recall correctly, I think worked as she worked as an exercise instructor and then a therapist and as a school teacher. Like, what was it like to be in this household where like you had the one sort of like routine method of making an income, and then this other sort of individual who's like, all right, here's my next challenge.
So, okay, so amazing. Thank you for the research. And my mom was a hypnotherapist, which makes her even weirder, right? If she was a therapist, a traditional therapist, you'd be like, oh, that kind of falls in line. She was an aerobics instructor, a hypnotherapist. She was all over the map. She would change her career every 10 years intentionally, just like completely upend and throw her life out the window and then change completely. So I had this wild respect for how she was living, because here she is, an aerobics instructor, and then all of a sudden that's gone, and she is a hypnotherapist, and then that's gone, and she's running an educational center for kids. She's doing it just to challenge herself and live a fuller life. On the other side of the coin, you've got my dad, who, yes, is getting in a suit and commuting into New York City, and admittedly hating it, and openly just like questioning why it was that he was doing this, other than feeding his kids and feeding his family. Again, due the most respect for that. But it was interesting seeing their dynamic, because my dad is like doing this traditional approach and at the same time upending it as he went, meaning he's just making radical choices in how he approaches his days to bring the most comedy, the most renegade revolutionary mindset to those work situations. And then you've got my mom, who literally is just every 10 years upending her life. So I was inspired by both of them, meaning, from my dad, I got a sense of, okay, here's what needs to happen in order for this to happen. And from my mom, I got this sense of like, let's do this, which was kind of, an interesting balance between the two. So it was really kind of cool in terms of where the influences came from.
And thanks for correcting me. I want to focus on this hypnotherapy thing for
Oh
like a
yeah.
second. I mean, was like hypnotizing members of the family part of the dynamic? Like, what was it like seeing mom transition to that career? Because that's such a niche, specific, performative, cool thing.
Okay, so here's two stories that I never get to tell. One is that when my mom decided to be a hypnotherapist, I thought this was the most ridiculous thing ever. Now, I've since then met lots of hypnotists, right? I've met, stage hypnotists and clinical hypnotherapists. But back then, I'm 15 years old, and she tells me she's going to be a hypnotherapist. And I thought this was literally ridiculous. Um, she practiced and trained with professionals, and this was like a legitimate thing. And I still thought it was, you know, silly. I mean, I did that because I was a teenager. My mom could have said she was going to do anything. I thought it was, I looked at it with a bit of side eye. But what was funny was she decided she wanted to try out hypnotherapy on me in order to see if her training actually worked. So in hypnosis, you have what's called an induction. That's the time where I say, Ryan, I want you to relax. I want you to breathe deeply. And then you slip into this state of consciousness where I can, work with you. So my mom had written out her induction. And the wording of it was something along the lines of, I want you to relax. I want you to breathe deeply, slowly in and out. I want you to imagine a beautiful place. Do you have it in mind? Excellent. Okay. So she had that written on a card. She had me lay down on a bed, on my bed or on the couch or whatever it was. And she was deadly serious. Like this was going to be her first time out of the classroom and into the real world hypnotizing somebody. What she forgot to do was pause in between the sentences of her induction. So I'm laying down. I'm already thinking this is insane. My mother is about to hypnotize me. And what she says to me is, Greg, I want you to relax. I want you to breathe slowly in and out. I want you to imagine a beautiful place. Do you have it in mind? Excellent. Okay. When she said, do you have it in mind? Excellent. I burst out laughing, opened my eyes, and I'm dying. And my mom is like, I can't do this, and like freaks out. I'm like, no, 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 try again, try again. And of course, at that point, it's out the window. But she from there went on to hypnotize people and really do this effectively. And people would come to her for weight loss and smoking cessation and, stop smoking and all this sort of thing. And she just went for it. And it was awesome. And she really put me in my place and showed me that it could be done. And the other story that I was going to tell was that when I moved out to Seattle, she came to visit me at one point, and I'd been telling people that my mom was a hypnotherapist. And when she got off the plane and came through, the gate and whatnot, she had dressed up in a wizard costume with a full wizard hat with like stars and moons on it, so that my friends and I, who were picking her up at the airport, would see this wizard magician hypnotherapist getting off the plane. So she approached life always, and still does to this day, with a degree of lightheartedness, which is, and ambition at the same time, which is really inspiring and really fun.
Well, high five to your mom. That sounds awesome. I One of the things, last sort of Connecticut timeline is that you, as I've read, like discover an interest in performance and juggling when you're young and around 13. I guess two parts. One is I'm curious about if you can tell us about how you developed that fascination with juggling, and then also you had this entrepreneurial bent really young, and you started to kind of monetize that when you were still a teen.
Yeah, basically what happened was things have come full circle. We can get into coin collecting in a bit. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be a coin dealer and coin collector, and this on a level that was far beyond age 12. And what happened was I went to a middle school where they had after school mini courses, and I had the list of courses from the school that were available, and it was Dungeons and Dragons, and you could learn knitting, you could learn gymnastics, you could learn all these different things on Wednesdays for a 2-hour session for 6 weeks after school. And I wanted there to be a coin collecting class, and petitioned the school to have a coin collecting class so that I could study coin collecting. And they challenged me and said, if you find someone to teach it, we can add that class to the roster of classes. Well, I did. I found a coin dealer, and I offered to pay that coin dealer $5 a week, which I figured was like my allowance plus whatever else I could gather. And the school added the class to the roster of classes. I signed up for that coin collecting class, and the school secretary accidentally signed me up for a juggling class by mistake. I signed up for coin collecting, and when she filled out the roster of classes, put me in a juggling class. So that put me in a position where I was like, wow, my life is ruined. I'm not going to get to be a coin dealer. I'll go to this silly juggling class. And I walked into the juggling class, and the second I was in there was a kid, I'll never forget, his name was John, my age at the time, 12 years old, juggling 3 white baseballs. And I looked at him, and my head said, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. And that was it. Like literally started practicing that day, learned how to juggle, got excited, and then thought, you know what? Why don't I try to make this into a thing where I go perform at, birthday parties and events and things like that. So I started very early on. I did my first professional show when I was 12 or 13, maybe 13 at the oldest. I think I might have been yeah, I think it was 13. I think it was either right before my 13th birthday or right after. But yeah, I started performing, and that's where that started. Connecticut was a good time at that time because I was such an oddball and an anomaly. It wasn't like today, not to make it sound like back in the day, but I mean, really, like today, if you wanted to look up jugglers in your town, you Google it, and then there's tons of jugglers. There's people that, you can look up, snail researchers, pizza makers, whatever it is, we find them easily. But in the early 80s, when all of a sudden the Bennick boy is juggling, I was this weird anomaly because there couldn't be any other jugglers in town. So people were gravitating toward me and hiring me for stuff pretty much right off the bat. It was pretty wild.
John wasn't like your biggest competition at the time?
He was not. He was just a hobbyist. I wonder what happened to that guy. I should look him up on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram and see where he is. I don't think he's still juggling anymore. but he definitely was a huge inspiration, and the class was cool. It was taught by these guys, Mike Zito and Maurice Convard. Morris or Maurice Convard was, they called themselves, let me think about this. Morris and Mike. Molecular Manipulation. That was their juggling name. They had a juggling team, Molecular Manipulation. And they were probably just like a couple guys looking for money for beer and pizza who decided to teach this class in juggling, but it changed my life. And I'm still in touch with those two guys to this day. And it's pretty amazing because they have gotten to see me travel all over the place and do tricks and, do my thing, spoken word and speaking and keynotes. And they're like, what the heck happened with this kid? So yeah, it's pretty fun.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, so you do eventually make it out of Connecticut, even though I've kept us here for 15 minutes. And you make your way to where I'm at right now, Syracuse, New York, to study at Syracuse University. And on this show, I like to think that I'm broadcasting from showing the world from a Syracuse perspective. And I'm curious about like you in the late 80s, early 90s, like deciding that you were going to head slightly west to Syracuse. Like, what was the appeal of coming to study at our university and check out our city?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was getting out of college, I wanted to go into, either TV, radio, and film, something related to that side of performance, or realistically just perform. I just thought that would be cool. My father was a practical thinker, and he said, why don't you have that be the thing you fall back on and go get an actual degree, even if it's in that, but don't just, vagabond your way around the world right away. Go get a degree. So I was looking at Boston University, and then I also on the, TV, radio, and film side was looking at Emerson and schools like that. And then decided on Syracuse realistically, because my friend Chris was going there from my town and he was going to go there. And I thought, you know what, maybe I'll go look too. And I went up there and, looked at the school and I thought, okay, this works for me. In retrospect, it wasn't the right school for me. At the time it was, heavy party school, and that wasn't my thing. And at the time, Syracuse hardcore had not developed the way it was. Hardcore and punk rock had not developed the way it was. And I was really interested in that. It was kicking off, certainly. Listeners might not know a guy named DJ Rose, who had been doing shows in Syracuse, even before I got there in 1989. But the mythologized version of Syracuse hardcore had not yet kicked off. So when I got there, I was like, oh, I'm kind of out of place here. And it's cold and it snows, but I had a good time. I mean, I liked being there. I met some friends who were lifelong, who I'm still in touch with, and I definitely have a lot of great memories of it. But it was literally just me picking a school that my friend was attending because I didn't know where else to go, and I just decided to do that and lived on campus in the Lawrenson dormitory and just ran around in the snow all year. And it was pretty, it was a pretty strange place to be for anybody who was not used to that much snow.
Yeah, and just shout out to DJ Rose real quick for anybody who does not know. He's the owner of Halo Tattoo, and he's going to be a future guest on the show. Actually,
Awesome.
super good human,
Awesome.
and I will say, a huge fan of Duran Duran, as am I. So, we've got that in common.
That rules. And DJ was instrumental because I show up at Syracuse. I was this punk rock at that point minded kid, and I didn't know who to meet, talk to, or find there. And there was a store on campus called the Good Food Store, which was a health food store at the time. And I walk into the Good Food Store because I was vegan, I'm pretty sure back then, a vegetarian, at least vegan probably. And I walk into the store. Behind the counter, here's DJ Rose. He's wearing a Uniform Choice, a hardcore band t-shirt. And I asked him about it. And we struck up a conversation and have been friends ever since. But it was really cool to have him as a lifeline to that which was familiar, because what was not familiar was intense cold and fraternities, sororities, partying. So DJ was really grounding for me, and I look forward to listening to his interview.
Yeah. It's coming down the pike in a few months, hopefully.
Awesome.
But one of the things, and this is one thing I'm really curious about, and I want to spend some time at, is that while you're at Syracuse, you discover a performer by the name of Larry Hunt, if I understand correctly, who is a mask maker that does some funky, awesome performances. And you go to one of his performances and end up sort of befriending this mask maker that defines the next year of your life. Can you tell us a little bit about that sort of Larry Hunt experience? I'm intentionally hoping that you can shed some light onto his work because you're going to do a way better job than I will, Greg.
No, you're right. That's great. Larry, who passed away just a few years ago, Larry was a brilliant performer. He's one of these guys that makes us and makes me wonder who out there in the world is the person I never hear about. Okay. I can tell you what hundreds of my friends are doing today because I've seen their social media posts. You know who I'm more interested in? Who doesn't have social media, who's doing brilliant work, right? Larry, pre-social media, was doing brilliant work and never getting enough credit for it. He was a mask performer, trained in puppetry and theater, and he was making masks out of a material called celastic. And celastic was this fabric that you dip in chemicals that were very carcinogenic. And he would make these masks because once you dipped it in these chemicals, you'd lay the fabric over a clay form and then it would dry and harden. And all of a sudden you'd have this mask with which you could perform. It was very, very unhealthy what he was doing. And I hope that didn't contribute to his eventual demise because he was dipping this celastic in like acetone and methylethyl ketone and all this stuff you don't want to be around. Anyway, he was making masks that weren't just like V for Vendetta. Okay. He was making masks that were expressive of feelings and emotions. And what I mean by that is if I said to you, make me a mask that describes pride, what would that look like? Okay. If I said to you, make me a mask that describes apprehension, what would that mask look like? And that's what Larry was doing. And then creating theater pieces that embodied the feelings and emotions in those masks. So I went to see him and I thought, whoa, like I'm here studying communications. And granted, my professors are pretty awesome. And, I'm still friends to this day with at least one of them. And I've met some cool people, and Syracuse seems to have this like hardcore thing that's about to get started. But this mask making, holy crap, this is amazing. So I decided to drop out of school, having seen Larry perform. He had performed a presentation that involved him as a solo performer using maybe 30 masks in the span of 45 minutes to describe pride, apprehension, ambition, ego, all these different things. And I thought, this is something I need to know more about. So I asked him, having seen his performance and knowing he was from the town next door to me in Connecticut back home, I asked, what could I do to come study with you for a year? And he basically was like, I don't know, come to Connecticut, we'll hang out, basically. I, in my mind, made it more of a formal, what's the word, internship. And in his mind, it was more mellow in terms of we were just going to hang out and make masks and talk masks. Either way, it worked out great because I ended up making masks, learning about masks, probably breathing too much acetone and methylethyl ketone, and learned how to make and perform with masks. And then along with that, learned how do we use masks in society? What is the Ryan mask, the Greg mask that we present to the world behind which we are actually afraid or actually confident? Those sorts of ideas started, swirling around in my brain, which later most certainly influenced the way I think about the world and approach the world. So yeah, Larry was a huge influence, never, ever got his due. He went back later in life to University of Connecticut and studied puppetry even further. And I wish the world had known more about him. He was really quite interesting.
Yeah, and doing so, I gotta say, like, you're a fascinating guy, Greg. But I went down the Larry Hunt rabbit hole while I was doing some research on this, and he, was the director of the Mask Theater in Bethlehem, Connecticut, for a
Was.
very long time. He passed away in 2016. It seems like his family has kind of taken over, and now I believe it's the Mask Family Theater, which kind of keeps his legacy alive. But there's a video on Vimeo called "Love Is," which shows one of his performances, which is fascinating stuff. And I would just encourage any listeners that are sort of interested in this little rabbit hole to go scope that out, because I do think there's something to be said about paying attention to people who devote themselves to one specific thing. Because when I have listened to other interviews with you or read other interviews with you talking about your time with Larry, I had one very specific idea as to what this mask thing was. And now, having been able to absorb it a little bit, like, you truly see a mixture of obsession and community connection and creative writing and just the theatrical arts all melded into one very unique method of communication, which I think is great.
He was brilliant. The guy was brilliant. I mean, we could do a whole episode on Larry Hunt and I could tell you stories. I mean, I really, really think that he might have been one of the most influential people in my life because he's the one who at the end of the year, working with him and learning about masks and watching him in action, doing a show called Animan, where he explored the animal world, which probably got me even deeper into vegetarianism, veganism, and whatnot, because he was talking about respect for animals, respect for the environment. And then a show called Quincy Meets Shakespeare, in which his character Quincy explores the work of William Shakespeare and explores all these different plays and characters. That primed my brain like high octane fuel, so that at the end of the year, when he said, "What are you going to do next year?" I was like, "I don't know." He said, "Hey, I've got a friend who teaches at an acting school in Seattle. Why don't you go out and audition there?" I said yes, from the perspective of my brain is filled with Shakespeare from Larry Hunt. And sure, my brain is filled with the idea that there's a big world out there from watching Animan. And I went out to Seattle and auditioned at Cornish College of the Arts and got accepted. Larry was a huge influence in that, and credit where credit is due. Jennifer, his wife at the time, now of course widow, was highly influential as well in suggesting these things. So it was pretty huge. Larry Hunt was huge. That's what we should be talking about. The world needs to watch Animan, Quincy Meets Shakespeare, find every video you can about Larry Hunt. And yeah, and even before, for those really interested in the Larry Hunt rabbit hole, Larry was with Imago in Portland, Oregon, when he was living in the Pacific Northwest. And Imago was an amazing theater company. And I don't know if they're still around, IMAGO. So dive in, listeners. Go find out everything you can about Larry Hunt, and your life will be better as a result.
I love it. It's when we say apprenticeship or whatever, there's always just that, that perspective that sometimes the person who is conducting it, in this case, Larry, is just like, this is just what I do. Like, come hang out. And for you, this is just like a moment where you can figure things out. You do go to Cornish, and I do have to say, Greg, it seems like you missed Brendan Fraser by a year.
Did miss Brendan Fraser by 1 year. So I came into school at Cornish. He graduated the year before I showed up. So I came in as a sophomore because I got credit for freshman year at Syracuse. I came in as a sophomore. He had just graduated the year before.
Fascinating. And we've spent a lot of time talking about your education. And I'm just curious about like Cornish, you studied acting specifically, and then obviously went into sort of a career of performance full time. I'm just curious about like what sort of stuff did you pick up? I know that you kind of like rediscovered a passion for hardcore. You ended up, starting the band Trial and doing some cool stuff courtesy of some suggestions from one of your professors, which is a fairly unique experience in higher ed. But I'm curious about like, what about Cornish kind of helped you grow as a person, figure out, your confidence as a performer and kick off your career?
Okay, so at the time I was at Cornish, it was a very specific school. And what I mean by that is Cornish today is a multidisciplinary arts-based education, whatever it might be. At the time, Cornish was very intense. We used to say back then that it was a cross between a monastery and what seemed like a concentration camp of sorts. You were locked in. There was no escape. It was devoted, intensified training. And at the time, it was debilitating. It was challenging. It was uplifting. It was inspiring. So here's what happened. I ended up almost getting kicked out of school and was asked, well, not even asked, I was demanded by the program to create my own major, or else I would have been kicked out because I just wasn't doing well. And I created a major in my senior year that was around the things I was most interested in, which allowed me to explore things that were most important to me at the time: literature and theatrical performance and theater history and things like that. And I ended up meeting some really fascinating people with whom I've had lifelong relationships. One in particular, a guy named John Wilson, who is the greatest genius you've never heard of, like Larry Hunt. This is the theme now. Really, Ryan and Greg are just here, listeners, to tell you about people who are not us. John Wilson was he's still alive, a theater history professor, performance production professor, playwright, and I would say had the deepest, biggest influence on my life I sometimes wonder, was my mom a bigger influence for birthing me or John Wilson for his academic influence? The guy was immense. In being at Cornish and studying acting and studying vocal technique, I learned about how to be on stage as a performer. From learning about plays and the way plays work, I learned about writing and communication from the stage. But from John Wilson, I learned how to be a human being and an artist, and what that signifies and what it means in terms of aesthetics and approach to art and how to share it and what it all signifies. I can't even say enough about him. John was a huge influence. He always cringes when I talk about him too much because has no ego whatsoever about this sort of thing. But I can't say enough about the guy. He basically pushed the limits of education and teaching of students as far as they could go. Stories to follow if you're interested.
Sounds great. Well, let's I want to talk a little bit more about you, Greg. We've done a good job of highlighting some amazing other humans. And I'm curious about like, Seattle has its own sort of like just awesome culture to it, and is a place where like I don't know if it's as weird as Portland, but it accepts weird quite a bit. So like the idea of like, hey, I'm a juggler, coin collector, I like metal detecting and Rubik's cubes and whatever is not a strange thing to enter into a conversation at any coffee house in Seattle.
Right.
But I'm curious about your transition out of academia into the professional sphere and discovering that you could make a career as a performer. Like, what was that transition like? You obviously you had been figuring out how to make money since you were 13 and juggling, and taking the job from the clown. But what was it like, getting to a place where the stakes were a little bit higher?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great question. I think that you have to figure out one needs to figure out who their audience is. Okay, so let's say you and I decide we're going to be the Ryan and Greg show. We're going to juggle. We're going to talk about computer science. We're going to talk about I don't know, whatever it might be. We're going to perform. Who is the audience? That's the important thing, and that's the takeaway for the listeners. Like I could sit here and tell you what I did, but I'd rather almost, and I'm happy to share that. But I'd also rather have listeners think, how could I do this thing, right? Because I've made my living, as an artist and as a presenter and as a, communicator and, now keynote speaker for my entire life. How can someone do that thing? Okay, who's the audience? Let's say we do the Ryan and Greg show. Why? Who's it for? Okay, well, let's say we're going to do church events. Okay, great. Now we've got an audience. We start coming up with our material. We got to make sure that people who go to church events like it or are challenged by it or whatever it might be. And then we market to that audience. We start sending out, emails to every single church in the world saying we're the Ryan and Greg show and we do this whole thing and blah, blah, blah. That's the same way that it happened for me. I started trying to figure out who's my audience. And at the time I was performing at summertime events. I was performing at festivals and fairs. And I decided to pitch those audiences. And you could go deep with any audience you choose. If somebody is listening to this and they think, you know what, I'm really interested in basketry for whatever reason. Okay, are you going to make cheap baskets for the most number of people? Or are you going to make really high-end baskets for very few people? Where are you going to sell these things? In stores? Are you going to sell them at street fairs? Are you going to sell them on your own website? Who's the person who buys the baskets? Start asking these questions, and all of a sudden a market starts to form in your mind that you can pursue. This is exactly what I did back in the day. I was like, okay, I want to start off, I'm going to be a juggler. I don't want to be a risque juggler, like a stand-up comedian at a bar. I want to be somebody who is family friendly. So with that in mind, where are family friendly events? Okay, they're at company picnics, they're at fairs and festivals. And I started pursuing those markets. And at the time, dude, I was sending out like physical pieces of paper in the mail, like saying, hey, I'm Greg Bennick. This is like pre-email. So that's basically what I did. I started to build a little bit of a market that grew with the fairs and festivals and did quite well. It was fun. It was fun to try to figure that out. I like the constant puzzle figuring outing of this sort of thing. Case in point, it's now 2024. When you and I hang up in 5 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it might be, I'm going to go back to figure outing my next step with keynote speaking, my new promo video, the new market I'm approaching, all of that sort of thing, the new book that's coming out, we'll get into some of these things. This is a constant process. And the reason I say that is because if there's a listener out there and they're thinking to themselves, wow, I really want to be a writer, I really want to be a professional cyclist, it's not going to go perfectly ever. Ever. You're going to constantly be reinventing. And that's what I started to do when I was here at the proverbial coffee shop telling people that I was a Rubik's Cube, metal detecting, coin collecting, punk rock juggler, is like, okay, what does that mean? Who's the market? Where am I going after? And I did that because I thought it would be a fun challenge. I didn't do it, to be the capitalist juggler and make the most money in the world. I did it because I thought it'd be a fun challenge. I mean, it's the same reason I did spoken word, where you and I met and did these spoken word tours. I literally did it just to challenge myself. It's the reason that when I was in hardcore bands and wrote records, I did it to challenge myself rather than just sit around and wait to die. I thought, you know what? I'm going to die. So while I'm waiting, why don't I do some stuff that's challenging and interesting to me? So that's basically where the juggling career, more or less, and the speaking career came from. It's all about challenging myself and seeing how far this can go.
And I'm going to apologize for getting into the weeds with this next question, but I'm just inevitably curious. Like, when it came to you deciding, all right, I'm doing this family-friendly juggling, I'm going to be doing fairs and festivals and stuff. You're somebody who's very worldly, and I'm curious about two things. One is like, can you give us just an idea of what a beginning career Greg Bennick juggling performance looked like?
Sure.
And then number two is like, were you from the beginning doing the sort of touring circuit? Were you just sticking to the Northwest? Were you, just sticking to Seattle? Can you kind of give us an idea about like where your performances were taking you in the beginning?
That's a great question. And I don't get asked that ever. And what's cool about it is that it makes me think of something that happened that changed everything, which was that originally I was doing strolling performance, meaning I didn't have an hour of material. I didn't have routines set. I knew how to juggle. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to market myself as a strolling performer who shows up at fairs and festivals and literally walks around juggling and talks to people. So I would have 3 juggling clubs and I would walk around and I would interact with people. That was it. That's all I had. I didn't have like, okay, everybody, showtime, 5 minutes from now. Hey, welcome, blah, blah, blah. I didn't have any of that material. So I was walking around an event in Linwood, Washington, 20 minutes north of Seattle, and a man came up to me and said, hey, juggler, do you have a card? And I was like, sure. And I had a very rudimentary card, Greg Bennick juggler, whatever, the phone number at the time. And I gave it to the guy. It turns out he was an agent. His name was Craig Cook. For those who want to go down another rabbit hole, Craig Cook was once known as the mentor of metal in the Pacific Northwest. He booked the nascent version of Queensryche. He booked a band called Rail, who were Seattle's local Queensryche. And he put on metal shows, heavy metal shows, at a roller rink northeast of Seattle. And when the Experience Music Project, the big music museum in Seattle opened, there's a little section on Craig Cook, the mentor of metal. Okay, back to our story. I had been asked for a business card by Craig Cook, the mentor of metal, who now in his career, instead of booking 80s metal bands, now we're into the 90s, was booking entertainment for corporate events. He called me the next week and said, what would you charge to do 6 events around the state of Washington for a company that's doing these company picnics for their clients? And I quoted him some low amount. He booked me for all 6. So then I did 6 events around Washington. After that, he said, how about 14 events on the West Coast? And I was like, okay. We did 14 for the same company across the West Coast, picnics for kids and families, and there was professional basketball players involved. The point is, he then said, how about 21 dates across the western half of the United States? Then it became every major city from Chicago to Honolulu. So all of a sudden, I've taken this strolling juggling thing. Now I'm emceeing, being the master of ceremonies, on stage for this touring show of sorts that went city to city to city around the United States, performing juggling. And then there was an a cappella singing group, and there was prize giveaways. And like I said, NBA players involved, teaching kids basketball and this whole thing. all of a sudden in my mind, I'm like, wow, touring, that's a thing. I could travel to different places and make this happen. But originally it just happened in the Pacific Northwest. That's what I was focused on. But as then I branched out into more fairs and festivals, instead of just doing the Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane fairs and festivals, now I'm thinking like, okay, what's in Colorado? What's in Arkansas? What's in, and then my scope, my field of vision became broader and more national. So that's how that all came about, was the mentor of metal.
And at this time, like, was that when the sort of for lack of a better term, like self-help kind of like component to your performance started to become incorporated, where you were doing keynote speeches and you were incorporating, juggling into different talks that would sort of like empower and encourage your clientele, or was that a separate entity?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. What happened was, it was actually a little bit in reverse. When I started doing the strolling performance thing, I was still back in Connecticut when I really, kind of kicked that off. I was doing performances, like I said, from age 13. By the time I got to Seattle, I was already, doing performances. And I shouldn't say I didn't have any material. I had a lot of material that was perfect for the types of shows I was doing in Connecticut, kid shows, basically. But I didn't have material that I could get on a stage and entertain adults with as well. But when I was strolling and doing strolling shows in Connecticut, I did performances for corporate groups and tailored what I was doing to them. I changed the kind of banter that I would offer to the client, to whoever had hired me, and that was more of a courtesy than anything else. And also, audiences appreciate it. You know what I mean? If you and I go off on a deep end tangent today and talk about the diameter of pinballs, and what pinball diameter is best in a machine, I'm going to be fascinated, but we're going to lose 90% of the audience probably, who are here to hear interesting stories from bizarro ding dongs like me. The point is that I had been specifying and tailoring material going back to when I was a kid, really. And I kind of started thinking of it less as self-help, more as motivational, because that's what was really big at the time. Like self-help, I don't, I talk about it in my book actually, and I find self-help really bizarre. I'm not really not too into it. It's very strange. And it helps a lot of people, but it's not my jam. But at the time that I was coming up and performing in the 90s, motivational speaking was the thing, right? So I started thinking, okay, if I have a positive slant on the juggling show, that becomes more quote unquote motivational. So that's where that kind of started. It wasn't really as much self-help as it was motivational. And the reason for that is because that was the flavor du jour at the time. That was the thing. Motivational speakers, Tony Robbins, all those sorts of folks were kicking off. And I was inspired. I was intrigued because I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be a juggler who also had people thinking at the same time. I'm putting this in perspective the first time. Like I remember telling somebody who was far senior to me when I was, heading out to Seattle, that I wanted to create juggling pieces that make people think about the world around them. And I remember him saying, entertain first, let the thinking come as a surprise. And that was really a fundamental moment. Like that's kind of cool. I haven't thought about that in a while. So anyway, that's why I'm like, yeah, wow, my life. I understand this. Anyway.
Well, that gives me a really good through line, and this is not a punk and hardcore podcast, but one of the things that I think you might be able to help shed light on, that I think is going to tie into our talks about keynotes momentarily, is that so you sang for the band Trial.
Yep.
And in the punk and hardcore space, like a lot of people who have never been to shows just assume that it's like a bunch of kids in mohawks, like drinking 40s and doing whatever. And in the sort of specific brand of punk, the sort of hardcore sphere, the idea, and this is something that I sincerely believe is the heart of the hardcore experience, is the idea that like you are there to open yourself up to new experiences, and a lot of that is through the medium of banter and talking and speeches in between songs. And Trial was known for that. Like you guys were a band that was not afraid to put forward ideas about the straight edge movement, about animal rights. And other than just being like, here's the next song, it was like, here's what this song's about. Let's take a moment to just mellow and appreciate that. Okay, cool. Here's the aggression. And I'm curious about like how being a front man for Trial played into you figuring out the means of putting forward positive messaging in this much more corporate kind of performance method?
No, that's a great question. And what the tie-in is that I've always thought about both as being about human beings. So rather, the times in my life that I've been least happy with my performances as a speaker juggler for the quote unquote corporate world are the times when I have positioned myself as the corporate business guy. It's not me. It's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people. I'm interested in learning what we fear, what we like, what we hate, what we love, what upsets us, what intimidates us, and what inspires us. That's what trial was an exploration into those things. It was basically a social experiment carried out all over the planet, like to learn, like, okay, how do people in Syracuse react to these ideas? How do people in Berlin react to these ideas? If I'm in Mexico City or Guadalajara, how do people react to these ideas here? What's most important to them? And then having conversations about that. It was like a social experiment carried out without any specific methodology. It was an experiment in human beings. So then when I would go into a corporate setting and be entertaining or speaking, it was never from the perspective of, let's destroy the world and make as much money as possible, but rather, why are we here? What are we doing? What about this is interesting to us? And where are we coming from? Why are we showing up tomorrow? Which, to be totally honest, was to my detriment. Like, people would see on my website, oh, perform for, and these names of corporations, and they figured that I would get off stage with trial, having talked about, like, live your life, be passionate, that sort of thing, and then walk into the corporate space and be like, destroy the punks, like, we must profit at any cost, which was never, ever, ever the case. Instead, I was going in basically like taking the ideas that we had all learned about who we are and what we do, and then transposing them to just an environment where instead of people wearing punk rock t-shirts, they might have been wearing suits and ties. But we're talking about the same thing. What do we fear? What are we about? What are we doing? And I was always fascinated by the idea that people would live their entire lives in jobs that they didn't like and that they wanted something more. Well, that was always a theme in trial shows. Are you living the life that you want? Do we want something more? How can we make this better? Same was true for the corporate clients. How can we make this better? Not how can we dominate and destroy better? How can we make this better for ourselves and for the people that we're serving? And to be honest, the list of clients that I turned down was at times more extensive than the list of clients I took, because I didn't want to be working for client A, B, and C, who were doing things that I literally didn't want to support or be a part of, much to my detriment. And I say that because I lost a lot of opportunities when I would get calls for keynotes and be like, nah, I don't think I'm going to keynote for the National Meat Association, but thank you. I really appreciate it. That sort of thing. Anyway, the point is, it was always an exploration into human beings and why we do what we do and how we get through a very complicated, overwhelming existence. So yeah, that was the tie-in and the crossover, really.
Well, and I just love it because I think like the idea that like, yo, I just played this like crazy festival where, I gave a speech about, factory farming while also screaming my lungs out, to all of a sudden being like, all right, so tomorrow I have to teach a bunch of people at Nintendo how to juggle. Like, it's just such a
100%.
fascinating juxtaposition all the time.
All the time, like to the point where, and to the credit of Tim McIntosh, the other members of trial, who were very, very patient, or not so patient at times with me. My schedule dictated a lot of things that in retrospect, I could have made different choices about. And what I mean is that there were times where I would fly away from tour, trial would play, I would literally get on a plane right after I got off stage, sweaty and everything, get on a plane, fly somewhere across the United States, put on maybe a button-down shirt, and say to audiences the same thing that I'd been saying on stage to 50 kids the night before in the sweaty venue in Arkansas. And all of a sudden I'm in Topeka, Kansas, talking to people about, like, how can we live in ways that are more considerate? How can we be a part of each other's lives in supportive ways in the community, or whatever it might be, and juggling and blah, blah, blah. Thank you very much. Collect the check, get back on a plane, fly back to tour where my band members have been sitting, sweating in a parking lot, eating Subway sandwiches. And I show up and I'm like, hey, I'm back. Let's continue the punk rock tour. And they were like, we hate you. And understandably so, we did that all the time. And it's like, you know what? I'm seeing Tim McIntosh for a walk today around a lake. I'm going to apologize to him for that. So thank you for this being therapeutic and helping my relationship with Tim get stronger after 20 years, because these guys were so patient with me as I did this often.
Well, in the theme of bringing the world together, give them a high five for me as well. That way we have that Syracuse, New York connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I will.
Awesome. Well,
yeah.
Well, so you, I keep saying so you, but you're a keynote speaker, you're a juggler, you're doing all these different things, and we're going to talk about your book shortly, which I think will complement a lot of the keynote stuff. But one thing I'm curious about is your ability to transition this mindset of who is my audience, at the drop of a hat. And one of the things that I haven't really heard you talk about, and I'm not sure if this is a good question, is like, how did you transition your business in COVID? Like, I've seen videos of you like teaching people how to juggle through Zoom. And I'm just curious about like, taking this experience where it's like the interpersonal, like you are confronted with me in a space. Guess what? I'm going to be throwing you a ball and having you throw it back at me. Method where it really does humanize everybody in the room, where your job titles no longer matter, to all of a sudden transitioning to a space where you're a little rectangle on a screen. Yep. I'm just curious about like, what was that sort of pivot like for you?
Amazing question, because everything changed, as we all know, in the span of a week, basically, when the world shut down. It's so fascinating to me. I can't wait to read 100 books by sociologists about this in the next, few decades. So all my clients disappeared in 48 hours. I lost an entire year's worth of income, with a couple extra events in the future as well, in the span of 48 hours. Okay, so now what do I do? Well, at the time I was writing and researching a book that I'm still working on Ernest Becker, who was a cultural anthropologist who explored, well, a number of different things, but mostly how do we live best amidst tendencies towards violence with other people. That's a very, very rudimentary and probably not the best description of Becker. He was trying to figure out why we do what we do. Why are we continually violent? What is our role as a human being in the world? Okay. I decided to just dive into that for the first bunch of months of COVID. And then I was like, oh, that's fun. Yeah, it's fun being a full-time researcher of a guy that died in 1974. How do I eat? So I changed the model. And I mean, like, viewers can't see that I'm sitting here in this, in a virtual studio in Seattle. And let me turn on the lights in the studio. So there we go. The point is that like I am surrounded as I speak to you by 3 different cameras, a full lighting package, video switcher, and the whole deal. That's what we all had to do. I'm going to shut this off and be more casual with you. That's what we all had to do as performers or speakers, is switch to virtual. So I switched to virtual and then tried to figure out what performance routines, what interactive approaches would work to virtual audiences, or work for virtual audiences, to make them feel as though they were part of an experience. It's very easy if you, me, and 400 of our friends are sitting in a room and I say, Ryan, come up on stage, and we do some type of routine and everyone laughs and it's fun. It's a lot harder when everyone's just staring at a screen. So the transition to virtual was one of connection, and one of making connection the fore, meaning what helps us connect? How do we laugh together? What's something you can do as you're sitting there that I can interact with, so that this becomes more personal, rather than just pixels? So that was a multi-year process, really. I think it was for everybody. I think everybody is still playing with the idea of how to make virtual interesting and vital, because they're still virtual. There's a considerable amount of virtual events that still happen. So how do you make it interesting? How do you make it interactive? That was really the question.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for trade secrets on this, but I'm curious, like, how did you identify what groups may need you at that time? And then just another, similar to the previous, like, can you give a little flair to the idea of like what you were doing in these Zoom rooms?
Sure, absolutely. And it's not even a trade secret. And uh, everyone needed me. And I don't mean me. Everyone needed virtual presenters. Everyone did. So, I admittedly didn't do nearly as many virtuals as some people. There were literally people who did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of virtual events. I did dozens and dozens of virtual events, but not hundreds and hundreds, in part because I didn't necessarily need to or want to. I wanted to do as many as came in. But the point is that some of the things that I was doing were interactive magic. I was performing in an entirely new way, in a way. For example, like I could switch to it right now. The camera's not perfectly set up for it, but I have another camera angle that listeners won't see, but that is a wide shot. That wide shot is where I would juggle for the virtual audiences. Juggling became 1% of what I did for virtual audiences. Interactive magic was a huge part of it. I've always been fascinated by magic, so I started doing more routines that were mind reading in a way, or magic based, and it's pretty cool. Everybody needed it. Everybody wanted it. Everybody was terrified and excited and wondering how we were going to connect. Humans are social creatures. We need each other. There's no vacuum in which we are just ourselves and there's no one else, and we don't need anybody. We need socialization. We need to be connecting. So in the midst of that need, the virtual event allowed us to have some semblance of that, even as we were isolated in rooms all around the world.
Yeah, it was so cool. And I think that there's, one of the themes on this show is or maybe it's a theme that I live by, but is the idea that whatever you're obsessed with and whatever you're passionate about and whatever brings you joy, as long as you put it out into the world in some way, people will respond to it positively. It was really cool to just kind of do some research on you and see like you blindfolded solving Rubik's cubes and seeing like a bunch of people who like clearly are showing up for a meeting that they're like, all right, cool. Is this going to interrupt my DoorDash delivery? And they're like just grabbing whatever they can find in their house to like learn how to juggle. And I just think that's like such a cool thing. Like when COVID hit for me, I was a middle school advisor, and I got a little team together. I was like, all right, our kids are really stressed out. We need to do a day. We need to figure something out. And like, what do we do? And this little hive mind. One person had seen a video recently on how to build. Like card houses out of packs of cards. So
Right.
like we went to the Dollar Tree with our masks on and bought as many decks of cards as they have, and then went and put them in the mailboxes of all of our students, and then like had taught the kids how to do it one day while we listened to a playlist that they put together on YouTube, and like that still goes down as one of my favorite COVID memories because it was like here's one thing, and I think that like it was, I don't know. I guess I just want to say, like, I found it really inspiring, even in our quote post-COVID time, to just see how you did that with the skills that you had. Because I would argue that, like, even though we can go to the local cafe and meet the local clown or whatever, we still need to be intentional about getting groups of people together digitally to have those conversations and demonstrate those skills because now we're so much more globally minded.
Absolutely. It's essential that we connect with one another. And I am I'm telling you, when I say I'm fascinated to read sociology books, I am fascinated. How did that experience affect us all? It, did it, I won't say it because I'm not a sociologist. I don't have the answers. I'm at best a second-rate interpreter of other people's first-rate ideas. But I mean, did it make us angrier, more selfish, more connected, more inspired? Yep, I think it did all those things. Did it make us more quick to judge? Yes. Did it make us more willing to accept other people and embrace them? All of this is like, it's mind-boggling to me. What happens when an entire planet has to stay home for a year, more or less? And I mean, granted, there are people who didn't. But more or less, by and large, like people had to shift how we interact with one another, and for better or for worse, and I think it was both, the pandemic really impacted people's ability to connect and think about how other people are meaningful to them. It was, again, I'm literally stumbling through my words because we're all going to be learning about this for the next 50 years. I mean,
Well,
it's just unbelievable.
Well, you are a pretty good wordsmith, though, my friend, because on August 20th, you have a book coming out called "Reclaim the Moment: Seven Strategies to Build a Better Now." And I've known you in so many different capacities, and I've seen you, write blog posts and obviously write an obscene amount of lyrics and do spoken word and write and perform spoken word live and on albums and things like that. And now you're writing a book and it's coming out and I'm stoked, but I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about the brainchild that is this book and how this came into fruition.
Sure. Okay. So I was approached by Wiley, who are a publisher and an established publisher of a couple hundred years. They asked me to write a book for their business trade division, and I accepted the contract and then realized, you know what? Writing a book that's a business trade book is not nearly as interesting as writing a book for human beings who maybe are involved in business, but who very likely are human beings. Like that's way more interesting to me. So that's the book that I wrote. And Reclaim the Moment is about ways that we can reclaim our sense of humanity and our focus when we've been thrown off track by the world. So I talk about 7 approaches in there, things to think about, perspective shifts that we can use when we have been thrown off track by a world that is increasingly complex and intimidating and overwhelming. There's no denying that we all didn't come through the pandemic unscathed, right? And the book isn't about the pandemic, but just since we were just talking about it, sure, the pandemic is quote unquote, listeners, I'm putting this in giant flashing air quotes, over, right? But it's not. In fact, COVID cases as we speak are on the rise everywhere. But the point is that we think of, oh, we're done. We got through that. When in actuality, the psychological effects of it and the impact on us is going to be felt for a generation. That's in addition to the world just being complex and intensified all the time and overwhelming. And I talk about in the book, a psychoanalyst named Otto Rank in the mid 1930s wrote a letter to a friend and said that he had temporarily stopped writing. And the reason he said, as he wrote to his friend Jesse Taft, was that the world suffers from an overabundance of truth, the enormity of which, the sum total of which cannot possibly be consumed. He's talking about this from his time in 1910 to 1930, that the world has an overabundance of truth. What's he talking about? Books, print articles. What would Otto Rank have to say about TikTok? The dude's mind would explode, right? The influences on us are from every possible angle. They impact our sense of self and our sense of self-worth. So I wrote a book about ways to bring ourselves back to center. And I talked about 7 strategies, believing in the possibility of kindness in other people. We're so quick to judge other people. How can we believe in the potential for kindness in other people? There's a chapter called Keep Your Eyes on the Knife, which is about focusing on what matters most to you. It's a juggling metaphor. If you were juggling 2 beanbags on a knife, where would your focus be? So what's your knife? What's the thing that demands the most focus of you? And then I talk about cultivating a revolutionary mindset. When you're thinking in a patterned way, how can we think in another way? Why is that valuable even? There's chapters on creativity and laughter and developing relationships, and then reverberating with these ideas and bouncing ideas off of and with other people so that we can collectively grow. So I'm excited about the book. I just finished reading the audio version of the book in New York City for a bunch of days, and there'll be an e-version of the book, an electronic version, and the print version does in fact come out on Wiley on August 20th, and is available now for pre-order, and for listeners listening afterwards, it's available everywhere, which is really cool.
I love it. And I'm super excited. And I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty excited to know that you were writing a book. And then when I saw that you were doing the audiobook, I was just over the moon. I think that there's something to be said about an author, spending additional time with their work, because there's a nuance in voice that helps convey moments that might seem minute and forgettable in text, and all of a sudden become sort of magic and impactful. And I'm just curious about what was it like to spend that time reconnecting with these words that you've been putting to paper and then recontextualizing them through voice, in over the course of a pretty lengthy period of time. This is not a short book.
No, it's not. And admittedly, Wiley has been most generous in that it was supposed to be a shorter book. Wiley was looking for a book of around 60,000 words, and this is considerably more. But they have been great to work with. And to answer your question, reading the book out loud is the first time that I really went, oh, I get it. It was almost like I was reading somebody else's work, meaning I sat here, I signed the contract with Wiley last August, and then spent the entire year working on the book, thinking about the book, piecing it together. There were times where the floor of my place here in Seattle was covered with printouts of chapters and paragraphs and yellow highlighter and redlined. And it was like I don't even know how to describe it, like a battle zone in here with paper all over the place. The point is that sure, the book all came together, and I read the book before I submitted it and finished the book and, went through it all and whatnot. It was only when I read it that I went, oh, wow, okay, I see what I was thinking and where I was going overall, like big picture. You sit in a room the size of a bathroom for a total of 18 hours and read to yourself, for a final book length, audiobook length, that'll be about 9 hours long, 8 hours long or something like that. But you sit in a room for 18 hours and read to yourself and you really get into the words and the ideas. And it was then that it kind of came alive in my mind. It was really fun. Like it was really, really fun. So I loved the experience of reading and thinking about it and diving into it. It changed my perspective on the book to read it out loud and to hear the words out loud. There were many, many, many times when I was reading the book that I thought to myself, wow, that's cool. As if I wasn't the guy who wrote it, right? That where I didn't really realize that what I was doing in writing and actually physically typing in the back of my brain was saying, yeah, this fits because this relates to chapter 5. Okay, continue on, type, right? But it was only when I read it out loud, I was like, oh, wow, there's that connection. Cool. And it all kind of came together and made sense. I would recommend to anybody who's working on a writing project, read it out loud. You find things in there that are just you don't expect, you don't remember, you don't expect. It was really interesting.
Well, awesome. Well, Greg, you've spent a good amount of time with me. I want to wrap in with our last couple questions, and this one's going to take a shift a smidge. But before the interview, we talked a little bit about the fact that I think I'm somebody who is always on the move and burns the candle at both ends. And you just take that to, I think I described it as an Olympic level. And you just keep going. But one of the things that you and I have in common that we haven't talked about is the fact that you and I both have the old DSM definition of attention deficit disorder.
Oh,
And I'm very curious about, just as somebody who's lived with it for a very long time, what are your sort of daily habits in order to sort of keep yourself on track and to just ensure that you're sort of getting the most out of your day and finding the most joy in your day?
okay. That's a great question. So yeah, I blame my mom. Thanks, Diane. Appreciate it very much. My mom is an absolute human dynamo wrapped in a tornado, wrapped in a hurricane. She is nonstop and always has been. And we laughed today. Literally, when I say today, I mean today generally, but specifically just the other day when I was with them on the East Coast, she was like, I'm so sorry I did this to you. I'm so sorry you inherited this part of my brain. And I'm like, you know what? You got to think of it as a superpower. So that is the first part of the answer to your question. When I have just my brain going all over the place, 100,000 miles an hour, I think to myself, and this is not just like a trite reference back to the book. The book's in a sense autobiographical in that these are things I actually think about. Keep your eyes on the knife. What is the knife in this moment? In this moment, yes. Is my brain thinking, oh, Rubik's cubes. Ryan mentioned Rubik's cubes. I really should be practicing with my Rubik's cube more, blah, blah. Sure. The knife is this interview. So throughout the course of the day, what keeps me focused is what's the knife in the moment, listeners, that's air quotes again, because for someone with ADHD, what's important in the moment just changed because now it's a new moment. But what's important is overall, what's the overarching goal? Where am I headed? What am I doing? Why am I doing this and why? I kind of use that kind of focus. What's the knife spinning in front of my face? Not the extra bean bags, but the knife to stay on task and stay on target. Now, all that said, your compliment about the Olympic level ambition is wonderful and sometimes true. And then there's moments like last night where I'm literally laying on my couch. I've been fascinated recently with Chernobyl, the nuclear accident in 1986. I'm laying on my couch reading about Chernobyl, thinking I really should get up and do something. And the next thing I know, I wake up and I've been sleeping, for an hour. It's not like I'm constantly like, go, 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 team ambition. It's more like go, stop, go, stop. But yeah, I definitely try to constantly think about what's the thing that needs to happen that brings the most joy, and then diving into that thing and making it the priority so that it receives the fullness of my attention. I mean, I have to work extra hard at that because my attention goes a million different directions all the time. And I never knew why until adulthood. It wasn't until I was an adult that I had a therapist ask me, so how long have you been working with and struggling with and dealing with ADHD? And I was like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. And there's a moment I talk about on stage even with it, where I called a good friend of mine and I said, you're not going to believe this. This therapist just said to me on the phone, can you believe the audacity of this? Said that I have ADHD. And there was this pause at the other end of the phone. My friend's like, you mean you didn't know? We all knew. So that said, it's a constant quote unquote struggle, but I use it as fuel, and I get excited by it. I get excited by the fact that there's always somewhere to apply focus if I choose to keep my eyes on the knife and decide what needs most of my focus in a moment.
I love it. What I'm trying to not to ask an open question, so I'm just going to go with the closed one, which is like, are you a note taker? Are you a list maker? Are you somebody who plans your day the night before? Like, he holds up a ton of index cards with information scribbled on them.
Yeah, I mean, even this is the index card specifically to this experience, to our interview. It's got your name. It's got the idea of meditations that came into my mind, but you used the word humanizing. And I thought, I love that idea. That's what we're doing with our art, with our punk rock, or our corporate presentations, or our writing, or our podcasts, or our teaching young people how to use computers. We are humanizing one another. So all of a sudden my brain was going off and I had to think, okay, focus on this guy. But yeah, note cards and notes everywhere all the time.
Cool, man. I really appreciate it. Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Greg, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you'd like to throw out there?
No, well, I appreciate you bringing up the book in part because pre-sales and sales matter. Of course, I'd love for people to buy the book. And there's a link at gregbennick.com. If people want to go to gregbennick.com, there's a link at the top, buy Greg's book and all that sort of thing. And I love that and appreciate it. But I just love the fact that you delved into my past and history, which is not like uncovering, oh my gosh, I didn't realize you cured cancer. Oh my gosh, you were the first person to get to the moon. No, it's like I learned how to juggle. I joined a band. It's like this is not, the stuff of like world-class human experience necessarily, but I've enjoyed the projects that I've been a part of. And I love the fact that you delved into it enough to know that my mom was a career-changing chameleon, and that my, dad worked in the city. All that is a testament to you being a fun interviewer. So I appreciate you very much, and I thank you for that. And yeah, if people want to get in touch anytime, you can find me on Instagram at Greg Bennick, and I'm happy to hear from folks anytime.
Awesome. And I'll encourage people to, once again, to check out gregbennick.com. I think there's some really cool stuff going on there. And something as simple as even looking at your LinkedIn profile. I think that there's some fascinating information there. So with that said, Greg, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been a joy.
Oh, I appreciate you very much. And I've loved it. I thank you so much.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Greg Bennick. He's just such a warm, welcoming, and positive presence. I always find myself learning something new, and today I'm really focused on this idea of mask making and what would my mask be? And, if I had found somebody that obsessive early on in my career, where would I end up? Who knows? As discussed in our interview, Greg does have a new book coming out, so please head to your local retailer, look for Reclaim the Moment, or find the audiobook wherever you listen to your lovely audio content. It sounds like it's going to be a phenomenal read, and I'm really excited to delve into it. If you're enjoying the show, I really hope you'll tune in for the next episode on August 28th. Going to do something a little bit different on this one. We're going to be interviewing Nicole Austin. Nicole is a chemist who has made her way into the beverage industry and is working in spirits. She is the master distiller at the George Dickel Distillery in Tennessee and is truly making waves in the way in which liquor stores, liquor culture, bourbon culture, whiskey culture is being marketed and is being communicated and is being developed. If you're somebody who has an interest in the behind the scenes of the beverage industry, this will be one for you. And just to be clear, I'm somebody who doesn't drink alcohol, and I have found interviewing her fascinating, and I hope you'll tune in August 28th. Additionally, if you like this podcast, if you're interested in other conversations, there are a gazillion different interviews for you to go back on, from inventors to craftspeople to entrepreneurs, all people, varied backgrounds, doing really cool stuff, and I bet there is something there that you would enjoy. As always, thanks so much for tuning in. Your support means the world, and please go make space for a conversation, because you just might learn something. Thanks a million. Have a wonderful day.